Quite a lot has already been written about Baroque art and architecture. Mostly, I'd say, from an art historical point of view, not quite so much from an architectural or an architectural theoretical perspective, although there is some work by people like Gilles Deleuze and Merleau-Ponty, and we'll be getting on to what they have to say about things in a subsequent video. In today's video, I'd just like to talk about something specific by way of background, and that is the fact that Baroque art and architecture is deeply rooted in the Catholic Church's tradition of representation of church art. During the 20th century and into the 21st century, this aspect of the beginnings of the Baroque mode of creation hasn't been discussed as much as I think it ought to be, perhaps because at its core, it's actually quite difficult material to discuss, and perhaps we've become a little bit prudish in more recent times about discussing this type of thing. We'll start this conversation with something central to Catholicism, which in my view is also somehow central to Baroque. In Roman Catholicism, it's believed that during the celebration of the Eucharist, bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. They don't become representations of the body and blood of Christ, they become the body and blood of Christ. And later in the ceremony, believers are invited to partake in the eating and drinking of these substances, not in any symbolic way, but in the fullest way that you can imagine. All Christians believe that Christ became man, but this idea is particularly central to the Roman Catholic view of Christianity. For Roman Catholics, a greater emphasis is placed on the fact that Christ had human form, that he comprised flesh and blood, that he had normal bodily functions, and also that there was some part of his nature which was unavoidably sexual because he was a human being. He had the same sexuality that all of us are born with. Now, this presents Roman Catholics with a slight problem in that, on the one hand, it has to be acknowledged that Christ has the sexual nature, but on the other hand, it must only ever be seen as a power for the good. It can never be seen as something that's bad, evil, brutish, or lustful. Now, this aspect of Christ's humanness, his sexualness, which is not to say his sexual preferences, but just that element of his human makeup that is sexual by nature, this aspect of Christ's character has been depicted in art going back to before the Renaissance. And sometimes it's been, as you can see in these pictures, it's actually provoked a lot of controversy. Now, during the 20th century, when people only ever looked at a piece of art and wondered how much it was worth and didn't actually see what was being depicted, during the 20th century, we began to stop noticing what was going on in religious art. We began to not really pay attention to what was occurring on the canvas. And it wasn't until 1983 when the American art critic Leo Steinberg wrote a book called The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and Modern Oblivion. It was only then that we began to look at this whole aspect of religious art afresh. In the book, Steinberg points to the fact that Christ is almost always depicted either naked or practically naked, and sometimes with not the most naive intent. Now, let's just take as an example the depictions of the Crucifixion. Now, this scene has been painted hundreds of times, and we're so used to seeing it that we're inclined to forget that it represents the gruesome murder of a human being. Curiously, these depictions of the Crucifixion are all very similar to one another in terms of their detail. And one detail is so obvious that it's actually quite, in a sense, hidden, that Christ is always the same in these pictures. He's handsome, fit, trim, looks like he works out a little bit, well-defined ab muscles, and at least when he was going through the Renaissance period, he clearly waxed. Now, he's got to be going through some pretty serious pain in these scenes, and yet somehow he manages to make that painful look pretty good. In all of these pictures, he's shown as being practically naked. Did you have to be naked in order to be crucified, I wonder? And you'd have to ask why, when a gentleman is being crucified, he would choose to wear a very small and almost transparent loincloth. And as a matter of fact, Michelangelo in fact, pushed this loincloth idea right to the limit. He abandons it altogether. One of the problems that the Protestant reformers had in the first place was the fact that this kind of art existed. They said that it was actually provocative of a lustfulness. In fact, they were kind of suggesting that there was something pornographic about it all. And this is the reason why, in the mid-16th century, some Protestant groups went around destroying religious imagery. They said it was harmful. The Protestant Reformation was in full flow and beginning to gain traction. So the powers that be in the Catholic Church decided to convene a series of meetings, they're referred to as the Council of Trent, to discuss a response. And one of the things that emerged from the Council of Trent was the idea that religious art would no longer put itself in a position that it could be accused of inciting lustfulness. That had to be toned down. However, by the time we get to the 17th century and the beginning of the Baroque movement, it's pretty clear that religious art is actually becoming in some ways even more provocative. And these paintings here, mostly from a lot of them from Spain in the 17th century, Christ is becoming even more handsome and looking even better in his skimpy loincloth. Now, in the Baroque period, it wasn't just Christ who was the subject of this kind of attention. Spanish painters like Cano were producing works like this one here. This is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, Saint Bernard claims that he came across the Virgin in a vision and that the scene we see before us here actually happened to him. Lest we think that this holy saint was just having a little bit of a slip-up, Bernard has a really clever explanation for what was actually happening, and he sort of frames this whole incident in kind of holy terms, which are almost believable, and if you look it up on the internet, you'll see what I mean. At the same time, Saint Sebastian's reputation as a certain type of iconic figure was beginning to be, let's say, celebrated. This, I think, is the version of Saint Sebastian by Guido Reni of 1615. Reni did a few versions of Saint Sebastian, but this is the one I think that the Japanese author Yukio Mishima found so interesting. The novel is called Confessions of a Mask. It's his best known novel. And then in the world of sculpture, we have this piece by Bernini himself, which represents the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. It depicts St. Teresa of Avila, who famously wrote that her love for Christ sometimes brought her to a type of physical ecstasy. And St. Teresa's writings are also very easily found on the internet, so you can look them up and you can decide for yourself what exactly she's saying here. But in this particular work, the angel is playing the role of Christ, and the spear is also playing a role. The controversial sculpture of St. Teresa of Avila was created by Bernini. And Bernini is somebody that we've come across before, because not only was he creating these controversial works of sculpture, he was also the most important architect practicing in the Baroque style in Rome at the time. He was a favourite of the Pope. He's also the person who was invited by Louis XIV to Paris in 1665 to design an extension to the Louvre, the one that was ultimately rejected and which we saw in the last video. The point here is that Bernini is at the centre of things, and one of the things that Bernini's doing right at this period is he's creating this sculpture of St. Teresa, which is at the centre of things. So it's an important part of what's going on in Baroque. The question is whether this, let's call it erotic aspect of Bernini's sculpture, and some of the other artists as well, who are also working both as artists and architects, whether this erotic strand, which is evident in the art and the sculpture, is actually making the move across to architecture as well. To me, at some level, it is. For me, it begins with Michelangelo in the Laurentian Library, and then I think there's something of it going on at the Teatro Olimpico by Palladio. And then ultimately at the San Carlo al Quattro Fontane in Rome by Borromini, I think this is where we reach some kind of pinnacle of this form of expression. Then a short while after, we find that it's kind of on the wing in Sicily and in Spain and in Latin America. So what is it? What is this thing in the architecture of the Baroque, which I claim is there, which I say is in some way connected to this erotic strand which we see going through Baroque art and sculpture? It's a very difficult thing to try to explain, but I do think that there are some ideas that are out there by various different writers, people like Jacques Derrida, which give some, I think they give some clues as to the kind of investigation we might want to go on if we want to pursue this idea a little bit further. So they don't cover everything, but I do think that they are kind of interesting ideas. So we'll talk about them in the next video. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to leave the conversation for now, but I'm just going to leave you with the idea, one idea, which I think there might be something to, and that is that perhaps the idea with Baroque architecture wasn't so much that it would convey a direct sense of eroticism or something similar in the actual architecture itself, but rather present itself as a set or a backdrop against which a certain type of religious ritual could take place. So that what happens is the architecture has to be seen in the context of the ritual. So that, for example, St. Peter's Square is only really St. Peter's Square during Easter, or perhaps when it's time to elect a pope.